Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Smart Trucking Live. Glad you could all join us today. Well, let's get into it here. Oscar's in Wisconsin. He says he's a big fan. Appreciate that, Oscar. But we're talking about rebuilding diesel engines today. Now, in my day, back when I was trucking, it was very commonplace for us to rebuild our engines. In fact, it was part of our calculation as to being an owner-operator because the engines were pretty simple to rebuild. You could generally buy a kit from the dealership for a Cat or a Cummins or a Detroit, whatever you're going to rebuild. And that was pretty much standard practice for an awful lot of owner-operators. You didn't need a high-tech shop and electronics back then. It was part of our calculation when it came to making money because we could just figure out. Back then, we used to figure like 600,000 miles roughly, and then you should start looking at doing a rebuild, and you try to rebuild it over a slow period of time. But things are no longer as simple that way as they once were. When the freight rates stayed flat there for a long time, and all of a sudden, what had been important to us was reliability in an engine, but all of a sudden, fuel mileage became a big deal because nobody was making any money because the cost of the fuel had gone up and it was eating up all the profits. So all of a sudden we went from making really reliable diesel engines to having to buy and purchase fuel squeezers or suck up the loss of the extra fuel. But when you tinker with something that works well and you tinker with it, there's always a cause and effect. There's always a reaction. And so the manufacturers started tinkering with the engines to get better fuel mileage. And part of what they did was make the trucks more aerodynamic, and that certainly helped. But then along came the EPA and CARB, low emissions, low sulfur diesel fuel. That all changed the formula as well. So you got a diesel fuel that was less of a lubricant, and the engines wore out more quickly. Plus you had all this emissions equipment squeezing down on how the truck, how the engine functioned. Basically, the engines couldn't exhale. They weren't allowed to blow black smoke, and that was what engines did. That was how they were like they had to inhale and exhale, and all of a sudden they cut out the exhale part, and the engines became much more complex and much less reliable because basically after about 2005, 2006, we were running, not me particularly, but the industry was running on experimental engines. And there were EGR valves and all these things. They weren't sure that they could make them work. Sometimes they didn't work. They introduced DEF fluid. And the end result was a very complicated motor that didn't work particularly well. And it was electronically controlled. But one of the biggest problems for owner-operators was it was no longer a simple and cheap and easy rebuild solution. So owner-operators basically had to come up with a new calculation, a new set of numbers to try to decide whether they were going to rebuild their existing engine if it was a modern engine, or just basically trade the truck. And there were other problems with that too, because as the years progressed through the industry, the build got cheaper. We had that liquid salt that they spray on the road, and that was corroding the wiring, the frames. It was corroding everything, to the point that now it's no longer a simple calculation about just spending $6,500 and in-framing your motor and carrying on. These days, Caterpillar is telling me, for instance, to rebuild my engine is $40,000. And a rebuild on an engine, any engine these days, runs between $20,000 and $40,000. And that's a considerable chunk of change. And when you look, if you've got a 5-year-old Freightliner, is it even worth a $40,000 rebuild when the whole truck might not even be worth $40,000? So it's a whole new set of calculations as to whether or not these days, if you've got a modern engine, and a lot of guys do, it's a whole new calculation when it comes to whether or not you should rebuild the engine. And some of the newer engines, they boast a lot of longevity. The PACCAR engines, they say they can get 1 million miles out of them. The Cummins engines have been averaging between 300 and 400. A good one runs 500,000 miles without an in-frame. And that longevity is lost, but the cost of rebuilding has gone way, way up. So basically what we're asking today is it cost effective anymore as an owner-operator to bother to rebuild your engine? Should you just pop in a new one rather than try to rebuild the old one? Or should you just look at trading the truck altogether, because that might be cheaper in the long run? Because, with all this corrosive material on the road now, you've got a frame that's starting to rot away. You've got electronics, especially the ECM, that type of thing, very expensive, can give you trouble. What's the best move for an owner-operator these days? And what are you guys doing? That's what I want to know. What are you guys doing when it comes time, when you've got engine trouble? What are you going to do? And they say now that really, and this was always true, that you should rebuild your engine before it blows. But sometimes that doesn't always happen. But it's always cheaper to rebuild it before it lets go than after it's too late. That's a whole lot more expensive. So what do you guys think is the answer here with these new engines? Do we rebuild them? Do we trade the truck? Or do we just drop a new one in? And they're not cheap either. Captain Nice Guy, so if we're talking about rebuilding stuff today, does that mean the Lettuce King is putting in an appearance? Well, he certainly should be. He's still at work right now. But there is a guy that sticks to old engines, and a lot of us did stick to these older engines just because we knew mechanically we could repair them. And he tends to rebuild his own rather than get into a new engine. But then again, neither one of us can run California anymore because of that. There are all sorts of considerations, but there's pros and cons to everything. So I'd like to know what you guys think. SoCal Sandman, I know I haven't seen him here yet, but he's rebuilt his engine a couple of times. My buddy Richard is on his third rebuild right now, and he's got a C16 Cat, and it's pushing 4 million miles, that motor, and he's rebuilt 3 times, which is generally the maximum that they figure you can get out of a rebuild before the block just is no good anymore, and then you've got to get into a new engine. But generally that's been the rule of thumb, that you after 3 rebuilds you need to look at a new block. Driving Test has developed an online training course that will help you get your ELDT certification and help you pass your CDL knowledge exam. Driving Test is certified by the FMCSA and is recognized as the best online driver training program in America. Check them out at drivingtest.org. Anyway, so that's what we're talking about is rebuilding the engines. Now I know, for instance, the scenario for owner-operators has changed as well these days, because all sorts of guys now lease their trucks from carriers, and they lease them long-term, like 5-7 years. And the motor's not going to last 5 or 7 years. So is it even worth rebuilding an engine in a truck that you don't even own? That's become a problem. There were things you could do to add to the longevity of the old engines. But the new motors, that they don't seem to be able to narrow it down to one specific problem to help longevity, because God, they're just breaking left, right, and center and all over the place, and it's always something different. So it's tough to know what to do with the new motor. The best ones have been the Detroits, and the few guys that I know that still own their own trucks that are running Detroits are rebuilding those engines. I've had one guy tell me that the new Cummins, some of them can't be rebuilt, and there were certainly other engines like that as well, like the C12 Cat, that couldn't be rebuilt either. But for the most part, you can rebuild them. Another consideration is, too, with AB5 looming and the role or how owner-operators calculate into the trucking industry if AB5 stays stays in law the way it is now. It's waiting to be heard at the Supreme Court. But suddenly, guys that own or lease may find themselves in a different position. So you'd sure hate to spend $40,000 on an in-frame, then just to find out you're going to have to be a company driver anyway and have the carrier buy the truck back from you. And, of course, you won't get your total cost back. Hey, there's SoCal Sandman. But, you'll be out the money. So there's another calculation, a new calculation that's come into being an owner-operator and rebuilding. Because, especially if you're in California right now and you own the truck, do you really want to sink $40,000 into the motor just to have the Supreme Court declare you that you're going to be an employee next year? It's interesting to notice when I was looking around these days, when I was researching rebuilding the new engines, it's gotten so expensive that there are companies now that specialize in financing rebuilds on these new engines because they can be so bloody expensive. Something else you should be aware of too, if you do choose the rebuild route, you don't want to pick just any shop. You want to pick like a dealership shop. Like if you've got Cummins, I'd have Cummins do it, or Freightliner or somebody like that, somebody that sells that stuff, because you want to be able to get warranty work. It's the warranty really that you're after, and you want to be able to get warranty work across the continental U.S. and Canada, because you don't know when the thing's going to quit. And a lot of guys, I know, like the hot rod specialty shops for doing up their motors, but some of those shops require you to tow the truck back to that shop for maintenance or warranty work. And if you're 2,000 miles away, that's a hell of a toll bill. So you don't want to necessarily get into that. SoCal says, I finally have my truck running great again. Nice and smooth, lots of power. I averaged 8.4 miles a gallon last night, so I'm pretty happy. I'm quite happy, he says. Yeah, that's pretty damn respectable. You can't complain about that. Something else with engines too, and this was true with me. It's obviously true with SoCal, is if you get a good engine, you might want to stick with it, because they're not all created equal. You can get a good one or a bad one from the same manufacturer, but if you've got time-tested proof in that you've got a good motor there, you might want to think about sticking with that. Deandra says, the Cummins N14 I'm working on needs new head gaskets and will also be installing a twin turbo kit. I assume, Deandra, you're doing that for the extra power. Now, be aware with the Cummins and with the Cats too. They suffered from, when you ran a twin turbo setup, they could suffer from oil starvation in the second turbo. There didn't seem to be, sometimes the second turbo would starve for oil, and it would make the turbo seize prematurely. Now, on the really old setups, when you had a turbo on either side of the block, like some of the KTA engines, for instance, they didn't suffer from that so much. But when the turbos were one behind the other, and even the later Cats, like the 2005 Cats, had a twin turbo setup for a while, and they didn't work out very well. So, Deandra, pay special attention to how you run the oil lines and make sure that second turbo is getting sufficient oil. $1 Trillion Dream says 34.6B is the only Cat I like. They were good motors. I've had really good luck with this C15 that I've had now since 2003. I've had it since, and it's been a good motor. Tim Fields says, check my Instagram. I sent you a beautiful 900A picture I see all the time. Tim, I will be checking that. Thank you. Dave, what do you have for a motor in your truck? I have a C15 single turbo Caterpillar. I've got over 1,100,000 miles on it. It's been trouble-free. I've swapped the turbo out a couple of times. I've done the injector cups, and I've done regular oil changes to that motor, and I haven't had an issue with it. It's been a really good motor, and I generally have had pretty good. I take really good care of the engines when I get them. I had an N14 that I ran over 1 million miles as well. Appreciate you all dropping in. Stay safe. Keep the rubber side down. and we'll see you on the backhaul. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.